Item: SCP-664. Object Class: Euclid. Special Containment Procedures: Protocol G316-U. Containment of geographically immobile anomaly, urban subset, is to be followed, with a containment perimeter established at the property's boundary. Testing is disallowed at this time. Description: SCP-664 is an anomaly affecting the approximate area contained by the third floor of high school in Pennsylvania, USA. SCP-664 is invisible to all observation and measurement thus far attempted, and is discernible only by its effect on living biological organisms. Living biological organisms. Tests: 512 detail species tested to date, crossing the approximate outer edge of SCP-664 are invariably subject to spontaneous and instant disappearance shortly after full immersion into SCP-664's area of effect. Testing to date has yet to satisfactorily establish whether time, distance, or other factors dictate the exact moment of disappearance. Non-living material, including clothing and equipment, are not affected by SCP-664's effect. SCP-664-1 is the collective term for any living biological organisms that re-emerge from SCP-664. To date, 67% of biological organisms entering SCP-664 have subsequently returned, with a higher and lower proportion for sapient and non-sapient organisms respectively. To date, the time recorded between disappearance and return ranges from 43 seconds at the lowest limit, to 142 days at the highest. Returning instances of SCP-664-1 have thus far been unable to provide descriptions of their experience during their period of absence. On 1999, routine intake DNA testing of D48120 produced a match with researcher Daniel Ambridge, of Foundation employment since 1972, presently engaged in study of SCP. Both were placed under higher-level covert surveillance. On 1999, D48120 was assigned for testing of SCP-664. On 1999, researcher Ambridge requested a transfer of assignment to SCP-664, which was approved following consultation with Foundation Internal Monitoring Group. Following entry into SCP-664 by D48120, and subsequent non-return after 300 days, researcher Ambridge was detained for questioning.